So when we were preparing for this very, very broad topic of people and histories, Niels and Luca suggested a couple of names that they'd like to start talking about, and I'm going to invite them to kick off with one or two of those names. I know you mentioned George Russell, you mentioned Don Cherry, you mentioned John Chitkai, whose name I can never pronounce, along with yours. Yeah. That's 2 out of 4. Where would you like to start?
If it's good, I could start talking about George Russell. I have to talk here? Yeah. Okay.
Make it feedback again.
Okay. When I started to this kind of journey in jazz in Norway, I wanted to write a book about jazz in Norway because I found Norwegian jazz scene very creative and very out of the main way of jazz. Also in Europe, it was quite, everybody knows this kind of sound and can feel this kind of sound, and it's very clear and sharp that most of the times come from there. And I wanted to go back to see where this started. And that was the point for me. In the late 60s, when George Russell moved to Scandinavia, he moved in Stockholm and stayed there for 5 years or something like that. That was for me the period that everything it started around this specific kind of scene in Norway. And then in that period, George, when moved there, had released his Linear Chromatic of Tonal Organization around 10 years before. It was in 1954, maybe, I think. It was a period that he was quite sick and also frustrated. He came here, and at that time he met these young musicians like Jan Garbarek, Jon Christensen, Terry Ripdal, and Arild Andersen. That was for me the point of departure, because from abroad, most of the time Scandinavia, it's one thing, and it was not true for me. At that time in Copenhagen, it was opposite situation than in Oslo, because in Oslo, in Copenhagen, you had many Afro-American musicians that came there and found a sort of very good milieu, very good atmosphere. And then Stan Getz, Oscar Pettiford, many musicians came there and stayed in Copenhagen. What's happened in Copenhagen, it was a sort of alternative hub to Paris for me. And then in Oslo, it was a very opposite kind of situation, because it was also for the mobility, it was not possible to do the same in Oslo. It was a very kind of far town. And then George Russell found this group of musicians that, how to say, were very well open in his idea to approach to the modal kind of organization, but at the same time, they wanted to push them to rediscover their folk roots, as Marcin said before. In Norway, he found a very kind of, how to say, stimulating place where to push musicians to follow their own folk roots and not to emulate or following the Afro-American style. That was for me very important. And then after that, George asked to these young people, musicians, to join to his sextet. They came to Bologna in 1968 at our festival, at a local festival, and then there they met Manfred Eicher. That was, for me, the real point of departure of the book, and about many of the very important things that gave a sort of new way to European jazz. One of the European jazz way. That's, I think that's now it's better to try.
I think yeah, I'd like to hear Niels' take on that, because you've already introduced a distinction there between the development in Oslo in Norway and the development in Copenhagen. Is that something that you recognize, or is that something you would?
Yeah, of course I do recognize. You said this microphone doesn't work, or I had to use use this as well. Okay, but it's a rather well-known story about the Jesuits Montmartre with Dexter Gordon and Ben Webster staying there for some times in the 60s. But I've looked at another key figure on the Scandinavian scene, or as I think the European jazz scene, who made an impact that went beyond. He, in fact, if you go to New York in the beginning of the 60s, there was the avant-garde scene where Ornette Coleman had released his first albums, and there was a development going on there, and with names like Archie Shepp and Cecil Taylor, Don Cherry, and these kind of people working together in different groups and settings. There was another man, a black man as well, but he was not American. That was John Chikai, and his story is quite interesting because he came from Aarhus and lived there. He had his dad was from Congo, and he came to Denmark through Belgium. Congo was at that time a Belgian colony, where he met I can't remember, a Belgian traveler and came with him. And then he got to Copenhagen, where he worked as a waiter in clubs where he could like selling cigarettes and stuff. But he was a tall, handsome man with that made an impact on people when they saw him. And then at some time he got to Aarhus, where he met a Danish girl, and they had 2 children. Among them was John. And his father, although he worked as a waiter and later on a doorman in clubs where you could, I don't know how to say it in a nice language, but with hookers and so things like that, he was also a man who thought his sons should get education. So he sent them to music school, where they learned to play the violin. And John played the violin, classical trained, as you said. He really got the bass from playing that. And then in the 50s, he was born in 36, but in the 50s he moved on to play the saxophone. He played with some local people in Aarhus, and even got educated as a chef, and moved to Copenhagen and worked in the Navy as a chef for some years. But in Copenhagen and in Aarhus as well, he went to classes at the conservatories, and again trained the class. There was absolutely no jazz at the conservatories at that time, so it was classical music he was playing, but then again he was interested in the jazz scene, and that led him to move to New York in 62, and he stayed there for 4 years and came back to Denmark in 66 and made some a beginning of a new story. I mean, when he was in New York, he played on John Coltrane's Ascension. He was in the New York Contemporary 5 with Don Cherry and Archie Shepp, and there was the New York Art Quartet with Roswell Rudd. So he was working there and came back to Denmark and began educating younger jazz musicians on the new avant-garde at that time. Yeah. So, and then he moved on to in the late 60s, or in fact from 66, he had this avant-garde, a bigger, like a collective of musicians called the Cadentia Nova Danica, with a lot of, in the beginning there were only 6, but then they became, there was, I can't remember, very many a lot of people in the band, with various instruments. It was not like it was. They were trying to do things with mixing world music and classical music into it. Yeah.
At that time, Europe was really open and ready for jazz music, and the jazz music was very popular. And I know the story. Not only Scandinavia was a special place. I know the story from Jon Christensen. I asked him, "You played with everybody. How it happened?" Yeah, and he told me that there was a 5 places, 5 jazz clubs in Paris, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, Stockholm, and Oslo, and they were inviting some stars from America, like Dexter Gordon or some other players. They played with local rhythm section in all these places. So he was lucky because he played with Stan. He was playing with Dexter Gordon, I mentioned, Stan Getz, with many jazz musicians from America. So European musicians played American jazzmen, jazz music in Europe. So it was very creative for them, and a great opportunity to play with originals musicians from America at that time. So Scandinavia was a special place, but not only France, Holland, also whole Europe, also Germany, and then at the same time in 60s began a new period of music. Avant-garde was started to be very popular, and then Europe was a big stage for and many places to play that music, which started I think both, but there were artists like you mentioned, Ornette Coleman, and not only Paul Bley, Cecil Taylor, who started to put some new ideas to be more open in jazz, and then avant-garde was spread out in the 70s like hell, actually.
Yeah, but what's interesting is that I mean, they played the avant-garde, but I don't think it was popular. There was not, but of course there was, and it was growing, and there was happening a lot of things.
Yeah, now we say that maybe it was popular, but maybe not at that time. Yeah.
Although it is the... Sorry, I'm going to interrupt.
Just wanted to add a little thing about Oslo. Oslo was, for me, special because, as Marcin said about the Rainbow Studio, about Jan-Erik Konsaug, and about ECM, I think that this connection that when Jan Garbarek recorded the first album in Oslo at Arne Bendiksen studio with Jan-Erik Konsaug and Manfred Eicher, it was a sort of point of departure of a new season in Oslo, because they had a very good club called Club 7, and every time that American musician or European musician have to record at Rainbow Studio or Talent or Arne Bendiksen before, played jam session at this club. That was very important for the Oslo scene, because Oslo was absolutely a very small scene. In the 50s in Oslo, they had many musicians, but most of them wanted to play in Sweden. That was more attractive. Like in Stockholm, it was more easier to play jazz than in Oslo. But the connection of this situation of George Russell before, and then Manfred Eicher, and the sound of the studio where Jan-Erik Konsaug started to record, it was a point of departure of a new way of Oslo for discovering a real golden age of this city. And many musicians played there with the absolutely unknown musician from Norway. That was for me a real new heartbeat of the Norwegian jazz developing in European jazz. Maybe it was not only one kind of element, it was not only Younger Barek or Arild Andersen, or yes, of course, Jon Christensen and Arild Andersen were involved as a rhythm section in many concerts with the best American musician when they played in Europe, in the north of Europe. But not only for that, because I think that there it started to put together and scramble a bit the knowledge and the what they were trying to do together.
Just to go back a moment to this question of the popularity of the avant-garde, and as we know, of course, avant-gardes are never popular by definition. Could it be partly to do with the mobility that playing in Europe offered, not necessarily playing to large audiences, but being able to play to many different kinds of audiences with different musicians in a relatively compact area of the world? Is that, influences get spread more easily perhaps through, from Holland to Germany to Belgium to France than they might in countries that are more separated? Is that an aspect of not exactly popularity but sharing of ideas?
Yeah, they did that. They played together in the avant-garde with if you take John Chikai, he played with the people from especially Holland and Belgium, with Misha Mengelberg and Han Benning and the instant composers pool, and so there was a lot of and Peter Bruxman as well, and Stanko, yes, Poland as well. So they moved, and of course probably not were a big audience for it, but they had some conditions to work under so it could happen. There was people who thought that it should take place. So there were clubs and arts institutions where they could get together and do some of their projects.
Does funding play a part in that? I'm thinking of state subsidy, particular economic conditions. I'm thinking of particularly Denmark and Norway in this respect.
Yeah, and then I would move to Sweden instead, because there's
that's all right. I've got my IKEA pencil here.
Yeah. That's good, because there's this with the state funding, because there's state funding in. I can go back to that with the Chikai, and his he got a lifetime grant from the Danish state, but that was further on, not in the 60s, but in the 60s. As I've often wondered, it was where did the money come from? How could they make a living from playing this kind of music that even today a lot of people don't recognize as music? And there's a funny story with the brother of John Chikai, Maurits. He went to one of John's concerts at Montmartre. And he said that if that's jazz, then I'm no Negro. That was at that time when you could say something like. But it was like he could. It was something he didn't or disliked. But then so how come that there were people who thought that they should get grants and funds, and then there were in Sweden they had this cultural, the Minister of Culture, Olof Palme, who later became their Prime Minister, was a key figure in there was this Workers' Educational Fund, Arbetarnes Bildningsförbund. I think it's called in Swedish, but they had courses. They thought it was important to workers to get education in a broad, when they go to the factories and go to work, they had to get education in other stuff as well. But they made courses during the winter where they could learn to play or do something. But what they did as well was they hired these professional musicians to stay for a longer period to do their music, and then there's this there came this an album out 2 years ago with Don Cherry and some Swedish musicians and even a Turkish saxophone player. It was made they recorded it in the late 60s, and it was funded by this ABF, or Workers' Educational Fund, where they paid them to for a longer period to just work with their music, which was in fact free, and where they put together a lot of styles and mixed them, like Mafi Faleh, the Turkish saxophone player, and Bernd Rosengren, Swedish saxophone player, and then Don Cherry. They had this collective where they mixed their ideas together, and it was a melting pot.
Talking about Norway, most of the time today we think to Norway very rich because they have a lot of money, because in the 68 they found Ekofisk oil in up to north. At that time, in the late 60s, Norway was quite poor because they got oil only in the 68, and then for having this kind of good influence in money and to developing also the cultural things, it took time. It was not possible there. Norway was a bit far from the other countries of Scandinavia, because it was very difficult also to move from south to north. I remember talking with Frode Gjerstad many years after. He said that it was for him easier to find good drummers like John Stevens in UK than to find a drummer in Norway, because it was easier to reach London by flight than Oslo from Trondheim, and at the same time it was a sort of period of wave, as Jon Christensen, rubato style that everybody wanted to follow, but also because in Norway you have a lot of mountains, a lot of fjords. It's very difficult to go from south to north. Talking with Karin Krogh, she said for going from Oslo to Molde you had to take 4 flights, or you have to take 2 days by car. That was not easier to reach, and we are talking about summer. If you go in the winter with the snow, it was very difficult, the mobility in Norway. That was one of the reasons why in Norway you had also a big localization and not big globalization. But talking about money, I think that at that time, as in many, maybe also in the other country of Scandinavia, Norway had a sort of flat society and a very social kind of social democratic kind of wave, and that was a lot of association of musicians like Jazz Federation, inspired by Emanom, and this kind of, how to say, in English. Oh, sorry, but I'm Italian and English is not my favorite language.
Same with me.
I'm
It's
like
not
a
my
baby.
first language either. No, I struggle.
Talking in
Every day I
English, it's
struggle.
like a baby for me to talk. But yes, what I wanted to talk is that it was a sort of movement from deep. It was not an upper class or a very. It's not like today that Jazz Federation have a lot of money from the government, have a lot of musicians inside. It's now it's a quite rich things, and it's easier to develop networking or stuff in Norway than at that time. That most of the people talk about Norway as a sort of third world of Europe. It was not the country that we are looking today, and that at that time they worked a lot together as a group of musicians, as a audience that were very, very passionate and very involved in this group. I remember at the period of Jazz Federation, many people in the audience wanted to support that, many volunteers. It was a very good vibe. That gives a lot of good vibes also to the scene. It was a very different situation.
I know something from the experience that as for Norwegian it's much easier to rent the piano, grand piano for 1,000 euro because they get back the money. So sometimes I had to play in not that great grand piano. But we were much less lucky. The Poland in communist time, if we talk about economic things, but it was not that important that much because Poland was closed with the border of communist, and we were under Russian control. But it didn't stop Polish musicians keep their passion for jazz music, which actually apparently there was a big movement to play jazz music. They could listen jazz music only from the radio station runs by Willis Conover, the great journalist who was playing the most fresh and popular at that time music from America, and everybody were listening only this radio, and that's how they knew what's going on in the broad. But actually the situation from government support was quite okay in communist time. I don't remember because I actually started interesting in jazz right in the moment that communism broke in 1989. But there was a great festival running from late 50s till, for 40 years. There was a jazz jamboree where American, Polish, European and American musicians were meeting on one stage, and it was great festival in eastern part of Europe. And there was only one place for 4 days where all the people were coming for this festival, and the really great stars and great music were happening there, and it was special atmosphere. And I catch this atmosphere a little bit when I was a teenager, 13 years old, and I was listening all the James Moody, Shirley Horn, Wayne Shorter with Herbie Hancock, many good European musicians from Scandinavia. So I grew up with listening live this old great music, and soon later I was on the stage. So actually 4 years later. So for us it wasn't that great. With support of government. But actually the jazz music was much more popular in TV broadcasting, in radio, and it was our mental fight with the system playing jazz, because the government didn't know actually what to do with this jazz. There was no words, so they couldn't understand what's going on. That they knew that it's from America, which they were fighting with Russian and American Cold War, they called it. So the jazz was a kind of freedom for musicians to play, to listen this music. It was really helpful to not getting bored and be under control by government, communist government.
So it's like processed songs without
Yeah,
words.
It was kind of this.
Okay.
I know, Niels, you're a vinyl collector, amongst
Yeah.
other things. The first record I bought by Ornette Coleman was Live at the Golden Circle, Volume 2. I didn't realise it was a Volume 1 until about 20 years later. And the first album I bought by Albert Ayler was something recorded, I can't remember, Berlin or somewhere, but not in America. So I grew up with this very strange idea that all the musicians that I liked worked in Europe, even though I knew they were American. And in terms of Marcin's just talked there about the significance of radio and a little bit about television, but we've also spent a lot of time this morning talking about live music. But what about the records? How important is the listening to recorded music in the transmission and development of jazz in Europe, do you think?
I think if you look at on documenting what's happening in the 60s, there was, especially when you mentioned Albert Ayler, his first records was, okay, there's this small company who's, okay, this is for the die-hard vinyl connectors, but I have to tell the story. But, it's a guy called Bengt Friebe Nordström. He had a company called Bird Note. There's the Swedish saxophone player Mats Gustafsson. He's been talking a lot about him, and because he's a vinyl connector as well. And these records is like vinyl records are like holy grails. He made the first Albert Ayler album, which was with a homemade cover, and it was only pressed in 40 copies. So and I don't know how many of them have survived. But I always thought, before this only came to me a couple of years ago, that there was this record existing. But I always thought that it was a Dane from a small town nearby where I live that made the first album with, in fact, who's absolutely not known for playing avant-garde jazz, the Danish bass player Niels Pedersen, and Albert Ayler from Montmartre, and a recording from there. And he made several, it was Debut Records, the record company. Not that there was many copies of that album either. It's a rare collector's item as well. It was a bookstore owner living in Brande who was absolutely into jazz, and he made this. He had first of all he had a post order company, and then he went to New York in the 50s, where he met Max Roach and Charles Mingus, and he got a deal with Charles Mingus. He had the record company Debut Records at that time, which was one of the first record companies where it was solely run by the artist. So there was no record company executive saying what you should sound like. It was completely Mingus's ideas all the way. And the Dane, Ole Vestergaard, made a deal with Mingus of making a Danish part of that company, and called Debut Records as well. And in the beginning they released EPs because LPs were too expensive in the late 50s. But then he moved on to beginning to record his own music in Denmark with visiting American avant-garde musicians, but then again with Danish musicians, and it's some of the first Danish jazz records, and very rare today. So.
You should write a book about it.
Yeah, and that's what I'm hoping I could do someday. I'm working on the funding for it. Yeah.
So if anyone wants to donate,
Yeah.
at any point during the day, he's here all weekend. You know, no donation is too small. Luca.
About talking about records, I think that Norway again was a bit different because they had a small label called Udin that was connected to the Jazz Federation at that time, and most of the recording were of only for pushing Norwegian artists. It was Younger Barek, Rosensfold was released there, and then after on ECM, the same. It was for the first album of Mascalero. It was a very different kind of situation. The record market and of production in Norway than in Denmark. Denmark was as the scene with many Afro-American musicians, free or mainstream at the same time. They produced a lot of music of these kind of artists together also with the Danish artists, but in Norway was more a sort of isolated clouds from the rest of Europe also for recording.
So, why is ECM so important then? What is it about ECM? Why does everyone always talk about ECM when we talk about jazz in Europe? What's important about it? I know you record for it, so you've got a vested interest, but
there are some musicians in Poland and they use ECM word as a, you know, and now we play a bit ECM stuff. You know, I don't know what it means, but I know that young musicians sometimes they're using this. So it means maybe ad libitum, rubato, a lot of space. There is a special way of sound, what Manfred prefers to record, but actually the Talent Studio and all this recording were made in 70s, 80s, and they were just super sound. There was a super sound. I mean, much better than American recorded music in 60s with closed piano, grand piano, totally put it just mic into the body inside closed grand piano, so the sound was special. With it's very characteristic, but actually there was economic reasons to do this. There was only one room, and they were recording in one room, just a couple of hours, and that's it. I like actually this sound of old recordings as well, but Manfred started to record on really professional and high-level audio feeling level of doing sound. But it's not only about sound. The ECM is Manfred Eicher, which is very charismatic and really clever person, and intelligent and with a knowledge all about art, not only music. So ECM is Manfred Eicher, if you talk about ECM, and he made a great mark edition of contemporary music, which is ECM. He recorded a lot of important CDs. I don't know, we can make a list with a lot of recordings. He did important recordings of Kid Jarrett, important recordings of Jan Garbarek, important recordings, I don't know, beginning of the career of Pat Metheny, beginning of like Off-Ramp, for example, Lyle Mays with Pat Metheny, Jan Garbarek did, Chick Corea did, so everybody, all the great names were in this label, so that's why it's important. And it still is. It's a great record label known now as a worldwide small independent record company, which is known all over the world. They took a Grammy, so very successful. Yeah, that's why it's very important, and I like it.
Yeah, I think that's where you can take it, where if you look at it today, that's where it really becomes interesting, because you have the legacy. I mean, that's what's Blue Note and Verve and all the others have the legacy. But unlike the others, ECM still has a high output of records, and always with this high artistic level. So it's that's what I think is so good today, that there's still a company where, not unlike what I said before, where it was bad that an executive said how it should sound, but I think it's good today that there's a company with a certain distinct style, with a man who's having a direction like Manfred Eicher, an idea of where am I going, and that he can have so many different musicians, because it really is very different what comes out. That's interesting and important today on a where everybody is talking about the record companies are dying and going out of business.
I think that ECM was very important along this year, from the beginning in Oslo with the Afrik Pepperbird up to the 80s and 90s, because it was a very good tool for promoting European artists abroad everywhere. Everywhere it was possible to see Terje Ripdal or other European artists because of the, the visibility of Keith Jarrett that spread. It was a sort of game of mirrors, because ECM was very well known also in America and abroad because of Jarrett, European Quartet, and many stuff, that it became a sort of new way. And then this idea that Manfred had from the beginning to build up a very professional label with a clear, sharp idea on the packaging, on the art, on the cover, and how to promote the artist at the festival. It was very easier for many musicians at that time to find gigs from Europe everywhere, because they released the album on ECM. Without it, I remember that Norwegians that release album on Udin could play only in Molde or in Oslo. It was not possible to play abroad. But musicians that played on ECM at that time had a very, very good promotion everywhere. That was, for me, one of the main things. But the main things for me, it was, as I mentioned before, what's happened at Club 7. Because most of the time we think at the Norwegian sound as only Jan Erik Konsaug, Rainbow Studio, and ECM sound. That's not true. What's happened at Club 7, it was that another sound engineer, Sven Persson, that was more dedicated to live session, imported a sort of new way of doing sound live, as Pat Metheny and other artists did with reverb, and wanted to put Pink Floyd sound into the jazz field. That was a sort of new way to, and without what's happened at Club 7, it was not possible to have Khmer maybe after 20, 30 years. That was, for me, it's a sort of fil rouge that starts from the beginning when Afrik Pepperbird was recorded, and then it goes along the years together, these 2 or 3 people, Manfred Eicher, Jan Erik Konsaug, Sven Persson, and all the community of the musicians. That it's not only this kind of fjord sound, this kind of space. It's if you listen Norwegian jazz, it's most of the people have a sort of idea that it's a very small kind of part of the iceberg. That it's not true. It doesn't give justice to the scene, because I can't say if it's more Norwegian younger baroque or super silent or Jaga Jazzist or many or Niels Molver. It's a very different kind of approach to jazz. And then for me, ECM was very important to try to find a way together, and it was a sort of small collective that connected to a very professional approach to a label, exported this kind of new sound, not new, it's different kind of way to do jazz, and then that for me was very important.
Yeah, but as there's something about ECM as well, because they have this high output of Norwegian artists, and they get the jobs abroad internationally, and especially here in Britain. There's a lot of Norwegian jazz musicians who's well known, and they've done a lot of that. So from my Danish view, there's a lot of they would have hoped that he had discovered Denmark as well, because there's I mean, it's not that the Norwegian jazz is way better or something. There's just that there was at a certain point there was happening something that he could develop and push out. So, and as a, I don't know, but as a to go back to the Manuel Conlector thing, I went to a store yesterday here in called Underground Solution. There was mainly dance and electronica, but found, of course, a Norwegian jazz thing from the beginning, I think 2002, with Bobby Hughes combination, but with Jan Munkeby. He played harmonica, but he's also playing saxophone and guitar and
also voice.
Yeah, he's an extreme.
He's a death metal voice with The Shining now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is it was this is a 12-inch maxi single with really dance rhythms and Karin Krog playing singing on it. So it's funny because they do so many different things, especially Jan Munkeby. It's funny to discover things like that. I only gave a pound and 99.
Did you buy it?
Yeah, £1.99.
Oh, a bargain.
Yeah,
there may be still copies available. It's the bottom of Coburn Street. It's called Underground Solution. And there's a couple of nice pubs just around the corner from it if you get a bit tired out after your record shopping. We're going to be drawing to a close fairly soon for the next main event, which of course is lunch. But I'd like to open this up to anybody in the audience who's been fascinated, stimulated, intrigued, or even possibly annoyed by anything anybody has said. Anyone like to make a contribution? Sir?
I'd like to just ask a question when you were talking about how popular it was for the Americans to go over to Norway and to play there. And how influential that was for the people in Norway. What was in it for the Americans when they were going there? Was it money or just spreading an American jazz scene? Because it seems like the American jazz scene is probably focal for everybody anyway. I was just wondering what was the main kind of thing for the Americans going to Norway?
I didn't understood well. Sorry. Could you please?
Shall I do it in Italian?
No.
So we've been talking about the importance of American musicians visiting Norway, or indeed Denmark, or indeed Poland. Your question is, what importance was that for the Americans themselves? We're talking about the Americans influencing, perhaps contributing to a Northern European jazz culture. What do the Americans get out of that? Apart from money, I assume. Lots and lots of money.
Yeah.
Is there a cultural exchange, perhaps one might?
How to say, it's of course for America it was a good opportunity to show their own roots, their own cultural things, and maybe also for developing their own scene and for doing more business in America. To have a sort of showcase in Europe, it was very important also for selling things and doing business in America, I think. Then what it was clear to me, it was that it was not the same in the opposite direction. That's now, just today, we can show a bit more our roots to America, and most of the time we have to spend a lot of money, because I see that Norwegian Jazz Federation, for promoting Norwegian jazz in America, they have to support and send musicians there. But yes, jazz was started there. It didn't start here, and then it's interesting to see how it will be in the future, when also in America known a bit more about our roots in that way. I think that it's not better or not better about Norway or Denmark. It's a world that it's a
Would they have just said, "Oh, I'm just going to go to Norway to play," as opposed to Paris?
sorry, I
Would the Americans have had this idea in their minds that they were just going to go to Norway to play, or would there have been something central in America that was sending them to Norway?
No, I think it's a very opposite kind of structure. In America, I don't think that they have a structure that have to export musicians. It's your own kind of initiative, and you in Norway, now also in Sweden and in Denmark, many European, also in Italy, we have very small opportunity to send and propose, but most of the time it's through Institute of Culture or other supported way. But how to say, for us it's quite natural to import from American musician in Europe. It seems a bit not very natural to import maybe in America the European jazz musician.
But I think there's something interesting happening in the 60s, which we really haven't talked about, because in Norway and in Sweden they have these strong traditions on the folk music. We don't in Denmark, but when Stan Getz he went to Sweden, he played one of their folk melodies, Ak Värmland du sköna, and now I can't remember what's it called in English. Doesn't matter. It's a great tune anyway. And he played it, and Miles Davis played it as well. Played the Swedish folk tune, and then Quincy Jones went to Sweden in the 50s with Art Farmer, and there was the beautiful Swedish girls and the music that made impact on them. And The Midnight Sun Never Sets is like a Quincy Jones tune that kind of like narrow it down, the sound of something Nordic, but it's made by an American. But they played some of the tunes, and then not long ago I found this record with Art Farmer. He played with only Swedish folk songs on, and Jim Hall is on the guitar, and a young Steve Swallow, 22 I think he was, and they recorded in Sweden with all the Swedish folk tunes, like you probably know Jan Johansson, who's made an important album called Jazz på svenska, jazz in Swedish, with the tunes, but Americans did the same thing. And the interesting, because it's not a popular album or an album that's known by many, but I think it made something in the way of Steve Swallow, the way he made later on. Just a few years later, he made a standard tune, almost the Falling Grace. There's these things that the Americans really went to Scandinavia and got something, and I think Keith Jarrett got something, especially from Jan Gabarek and the Norwegian traditions,
Swedish,
and Swedish as well. But so yeah, it was not only money they got.
Sir, at the back. Thank you for standing up as well.
Yeah, I'll stand up. We should also mention the State Department tours. I mean, we're not talking about the avant-garde necessarily, but we're talking about organised American influence, about the Cold War and State Department tours. I mean, Penny Von Eschen's work on this particular period in history, and the Willis Conover and the links to the CIA and so on. I think we kind of need to be mindful of too. So it wasn't just about disenfranchised American musicians finding a home in Europe, but there were also, American, targeted American propaganda and using jazz as part of this, as part of that too. But that wasn't my question. I just thought I'd throw that in. Actually, Luca, you sort of touched on it with the whole the Nordic sound and the kind of romance of Norway. I mean, for me, when we're talking about history, quite often history is written in retrospect. There's a lot of kind of mythology and romance that's bound up with the past. And I'm interested in, through your work, and you see the way in which European jazz is written about today or discussed or framed, whether there are any tensions between the way in which you see it talked about and the way in which it was perhaps lived and experienced. And you did comment on the complexity of the Norwegian scene, for example, with the way in which it's portrayed. But are there other examples of this? Do you get me?
Oof. Try to.
Well, actually, the thing is, the problem with that, you see, it wasn't really so much a question until the very, very end. Yeah. So can we just go back slightly and say, no offense, are there examples of...
Yeah, are there examples of do tensions exist between the way in which European jazz is written about today and kind of, and understood, and the way in which it was perhaps experienced? Is there a tension between a kind of romantic view of jazz in Europe that is kind of mythic, and I'm thinking here about creation myths now linked to Gabarek or whatever, or ECM, and Manfred Eicher is a great, this saviour or whatever, and actually the complexity of the history itself, and how do we kind of deal with that? Yeah, so there's several questions in there, but it's really that, do you get a sense of a difference between history as it's kind of represented, and historically, and look back constructed in reverse, and the way that perhaps it actually existed through time?
I see some connections. Like in 60s, European musicians wanted to play more in American way, rhythmic way. What that was fresh at that time in America. Now I see, after a while, that were in Europe, 70s, 80s, 90s, and now was also important for them. I see some American musicians now play more European than opposite. for example, Ambros Akimusir, Vijay Iyer, they David Virales, Craig Taborn, they want to play more. I mean, I don't know what it means European way, but more conceptual thinking about music. That's what I see now. That there are American scene which wanted, I mean, try to place or remind some musical character or voice from Europe, what was built here during the years in 80s, 90s, and whatever. So now jazz spread out all over the world. It's hard to say what's American, what's European. It doesn't matter. So a lot of things going on in France, in Italy, in Holland. We talked a lot about Scandinavia, but the important scene was also Holland, which is very into American jazz, like really. Yeah, it's now jazz is spread out all over the world. It's hard to say what is American way and what's a European way of playing.
And I think that's a fairly random but useful place to stop. So can I just ask you all to thank our three panellists for this morning?
Thank you.